My name is Sean Morales Doyle, and I am the Deputy Director of Voting Rights and Elections at the Brennan Center for Justice. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank dedicated to defending and improving our systems of democracy and justice. We are affiliated with NYU School of Law, and this issue, rights restoration for people with convictions in their past, is something that we really spend a lot of our time advocating for. It's a policy that we have a great deal of passion about. And so I'm really happy to be here talking about it virtually with folks in Washington. And we have a really great panel here to talk about it and hopefully answer questions you all might have about the legislation in Washington, about the issue. We'll definitely have time at the end for people to ask questions. Oh, and actually you can drop questions into the chat all along if you'd like, so that we can weigh in on them at the end to the extent we don't get to them during the course of the panel discussion. I don't want to spend too much time on introductions. We can really get into the meat of things here, so I'm not going to do any of these panelists justice in the way that I introduce them, but just a couple words on each of them. We have with us one of the chief sponsors of this bill that we're hoping to see move in the upcoming session, Representative-elect Tarra Simmons. And Tarra is someone who I am grateful to say I've known for some time and have been working with on this issue for some time. She's an advocate in addition to now being an elected representative of her constituents. She is the director of the Civil Survival Project and now represents the 23rd Legislative District. And I think she really we'll hear from her more today. I think she really can speak to this issue from so many different perspectives, from someone who's been directly impacted by many of the things we're talking about, someone who will be in the legislature working on this, to someone who's a lawyer and understands the legal niceties of the issue. So really excited to have her here. We also have with us Chad Enright, who is the Kitsap County elected prosecutor. And I think we're hopeful that we'll get some really great insight. I'm not hopeful, I'm sure we'll get some really great insight from him about this policy and how it relates to the criminal justice system. Obviously, he's an expert there. His background includes work in private practice and public defense work, but he is, as I said, now at the Kitsap County Prosecutor's Office. I should say a majority of his trial work was done in the Special Assault Unit, where he tried domestic violence and sex offenses. And he has also spent a great deal of time focusing on mental health issues and civil commitments. So I think he also brings a variety of perspectives to this work. We also have Terrence Morgan, who once again will be able to speak to this from a personal perspective as someone who himself has experienced disenfranchisement and rights restoration, which I think is always probably the most valuable perspective we can get on this issue and to really understand what it looks like in real life. Terrence is with the Urban League, and I hope he can spend a little bit of time when we start talking with him, giving us a little bit more background on his work. And Arthur Rizer, our last panelist, is the Director of Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties at the R Street Institute, another think tank, I suppose. I think you guys call yourself a think tank as well, Arthur, right? That word to me is, even though I work at one, is a weird one, so I never know how people feel about it. But Arthur is an expert on all things criminal justice and civil liberties, but has been, I think, a leading voice and a number of efforts on rights restoration around the country. And I know that I've worked with Arthur in, or parallel to Arthur in Florida, and in a number of other states where this issue has really been a big one recently. So a great panel and a lot of perspectives represented, and I'm going to dive in, and then hopefully we'll answer a lot of your questions, but we welcome more at the end, as I said. I'm going to start off with a question to really sort of frame the conversation, a big picture, and I'll ask Representative-elect Simmons this one. But I will say I'm hoping this will be a collaborative conversation with people chiming in. So I invite all of the panelists to follow up with points they want to make as we go along. I think that'll make for a more robust discussion. So Representative-elect Simmons, what is the current state of the fight to restore voting rights in Washington?
Thank you so much, Sean, for being here today and for all of your work that you have done for so many years on this issue. I am so honored to be here with my co-panelists and really looking at being successful this year in the legislature. Right now, the current state of the law in Washington state is that a person's right to vote is provisionally restored if they have completed their community supervision, so their probation, will you have it, in Washington state, and they are making payments on their legal financial obligations. So that is the current law. In practice, we do not find that prosecutors are filing motions to revoke their right if they are not making payments on their legal financial obligations. However, that could happen. And so the current fight of our effort here in Washington state is to automatically restore the right to vote for all people as soon as they are done serving their time confined under the Department of Corrections 24 hours a day. So this would allow people who are on community custody or maybe are too poor to pay their legal financial obligations, but are contributing to our communities in so many ways, the right to have a voice in their government. And so that is the effort right now legally, and what the bill will include is to bring it back to as far as we can go under our current Washington state constitution, and allow people to have their right freely restored as soon as they exit incarceration without that those terms of completing your community custody or paying on your legal financial obligations.
Yeah, thank you for addressing that issue. I think it's been some time since there was a practically real requirement that people pay off legal financial obligations in Washington, but I do think it's something that, the way that it's written in the law, often comes up and people have questions about it, and it's something that's gotten some attention around the country. And so it's good to get clarity on that. And certainly I think we're all happy to answer questions about that if folks have them. I do want to turn to the more personal side of this and how this really impacts Washingtonians. And so, Terry, I'm hoping you can start us off with, you personally experienced disenfranchisement, and I'm hoping you can give us a sense of what it meant to you to have your rights restored.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. As everyone knows, I was formerly justice involved. It was experience of, first of all, like I explained before, of the information that's been provided to me through my community, was that if you had a felon, you couldn't vote. So when I did finally get the right information to know I could vote, that my voice matters, it really was part of the process of my transition to know that, okay, this is another tool or another badge of honor for me to be able to vote. That's important now to me today. Now, there was a time in my life where it wasn't, but now that I live the life I live now, yes, it's very important. It's important to me to know I can have my voice heard, through voting. I think that if your sentence is done, the old saying that you've served your sentence, so you've served, you served your sentence, so you should be able to do things that normal people in society do. And I just think that, it was important for me, to me personally, because I wanted to be a part of the community wholehearted, as a whole, not as okay, I can do this, but I can't do this. It's, it's a big difference there. So, but I really believe that, if it can be passed that when you get out from serving your sentence, that you can move right into voting rights, I think that'd be big for a lot of people, because you'd be surprised of the politics that are taught between people who are incarcerated, why they're incarcerated. I mean, it's important to us to know what we can vote on, what we can have an opinion on. I mean, and I think that, that would be a big thing for a lot of people coming out of prison. And a lot of people would, look forward to supporting that as far as ex-felons coming out. And it would probably be a part of some people's transitional planning. Today I help people, with making decisions like voting, helping with employment, housing. I mean, I help them with all the things that I used to suffer from. And voter suppression is one. So I just really, pardon me?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Oh, no. So I just really feel that, to me, it's very important. It was very important to me. I felt a sense of pride that, okay, this is another hurdle I've come over, another barrier I've gone through, which is very important when you're in a transition state, like coming from a place of incarceration or homelessness or whatever. It's, if you have that record, and a lot of things are tied to your record, and you have a lot of good people out here that I think want their voice heard, not only in my community or people that look like me, but just people in general that have been, tagged with that. You have a felony, you can't vote until you're off community placement and you're paying your LFOs, because, I mean, let's keep it, just to keep it, on a reality thing. Today, in this day and age, people can't pay their LFOs. People are barely surviving, but Tarra mentioned that, the prosecutor's not going after that, which is a good thing. But no, but to me, it was, to really answer the question, it was a sense of pride for me to know that I can have that right to vote.
Thank you. And to your point there about people making it a part of their plan, Chad, I'm hoping that as a prosecutor responsible for enforcing the law, you can give us a sense of why we have community supervision and the functions that our criminal justice serves, and how that fits with this idea of rights restoration, and how restoring voting rights fits with the way that our criminal justice system is supposed to function.
Yeah, and excuse me. Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for being here. The two questions that I will frequently ask is, does this make us safer, and is it fair? At its base, that's what we're looking at in criminal law, and we're looking at in prosecution. Let's talk about community supervision and the practicalities of it. What is it really? In Washington, what community supervision basically is making sure that you're completing the requirements of your sentence, you're paying your fines, you're doing your treatment, whatever the conditions you had, and that you don't have any new law violations. That's a bare minimum. That is at its very core, that is the least we can do with community supervision. What community supervision should be is having people re-enter and be a part of the community again. That is when community supervision is successful, is when we can bring people back into the community. And what you're seeing around the country is a reimagining of what community supervision should be. You're seeing going from this purely supervising, making sure I get things done, versus more of a coaching, mentoring model. I think there may even be a bill this year to push the state of Washington towards that model. I know that's a model that's being done in Oregon right now. But the reason for that is that we can see that people who are part of the community and have ownership in the community, they're not out committing crimes. They're staying out of trouble. They are giving something to the community. You know, one of the things that we've done in Kitsap County that I think is part of that is we have a program called the Welcome Home Project. And the Welcome Home Project started through the Port Gamble S'Klallam tribe. And it is designed to essentially welcome you back to the community, welcome home to your community. And it is part of that general principle that I think community supervision should be, that we are bringing you back, we are welcoming you back. We're not just letting you back. We are welcoming, the community is welcoming you back. And so the importance of establishing social ties, and what you heard Terrance say, you know, he said, and I wrote it down, my voice matters. I mean, letting people know that they matter. Yes, you've committed a crime. Yes, you've served your time, but your voice, it still matters. And so I think when we look at community supervision, by having people vote, we are saying you are still a part of our community. Your voice still matters. And I think that is just one more step towards that coaching and mentoring and welcoming people back into the community. And then the question of, does this make us safer? You know, I have spent time as a criminal defense attorney and as prosecutor, and I think there is certainly an argument that losing your right to vote is perhaps a deterrent to criminal activity. It's not. The reality is that it's not. I have sat and gone over guilty pleas and convictions with people thousands of times. I had one person in 15 years bring up, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my right to vote. It is not a punishment that deters people. The punishment is going to jail and going to prison. This is a collateral punishment that I don't think it impacts how people behave. I don't think it impacts their behavior. It's not a deterrent to criminal activity. What it is a deterrent to community involvement. And that's I think is key. To me, that is key. And it is by allowing people to vote, we are taking down one of those deterrents to being a part of your community. And that makes people successful. People who are part of their community, have ownership in their community, are successful. That's what the criminal justice system should be designed for. That's what the community supervision part of the system should be designed for. And I really think that taking down this barrier actually is a good thing for the criminal justice system.
Thank you. That was all very helpful. I like that point about how it's not a deterrent to crime, it's a deterrent to community involvement. And Terry, I want to bounce back to you quickly here. you alluded to, and I didn't really do you justice in my intro, but you alluded to doing some work to helping people with reentry and getting back involved in obviously something you've thought of for your own purposes as well. What do you think restoring voting rights earlier in that process, and when people are returning and are being hopefully welcomed back to their community, what do you think restoring rights earlier does for a person's sense of engaging in that community and feeling a part of it and feeling invested in it? And what did it mean to you?
Well, yeah. Well, I think that a person that is restored that right coming out of prison or jails, I think that it's also putting them more in touch with community. It's putting them more in touch with, okay, I'm moving forward with something good because it has something there that, like you said, I have a right. I have a right to do it now. Okay, I don't, and a lot of people, I agree with the gentleman, with Chad. Community supervision should, in my opinion, should be more of getting these people involved with community-based programs coming out. And I think community supervision, I think where you lose people at is the supervision part, because you just came from being in a supervised environment and you come out to society, you're in a supervised environment. So I think voting kind of takes you away from that supervised thing, because that's something you would have the right to do, and you can make your choice, not being told what you should be doing. So I mean, as far as me, when I got my right to vote, or when I got out and people were voting, and I've said it before, my problem is that my community fed me bad information that I couldn't vote because I had a felon. And that was like forever. Then after a certain time, you can't do it after a certain period of time. You don't even think about doing it. And I think that's what happens with a lot of people coming out of prison and jails. Yeah.
So this really encourages that engagement early on.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, if you think about it, on a percentage, you probably got 5% of the people that come out of prison aren't saying they're coming back. They're coming out to try to be a productive person in society. And that's one of the tools of being a right to vote. And for some people, it can be a spark plug, something that light a fire on them to say, hey, this is good. I want that feeling again. I want to know I have the right to do this. I want to know I have the right to do that, to bear arms eventually. It's just, it's important. I mean, especially in this day and age, we know, I mean, look at the world right now. I mean, we'll look at the election thing right now. I mean, we're it's important to vote right now.
For sure. So, Arthur, I want to change the topic a little bit. Thank you, Terry. That was
you're welcome.
So often this issue has become a partisan issue here in Washington and in a lot of places around the country. But it hasn't been the case everywhere that it's become a partisan issue. And in fact, when we look at a sort of a map of where the states are on this, it doesn't really line up with the blue states and the red states. So I'm curious your thoughts. And I should have mentioned earlier, R Street, I think, is perhaps takes a different approach to some of these issues in terms of political leanings than the Brennan Center, and comes at this from a sort of more libertarian and conservative approach. I don't mean to put words in your mouth.
You can say it. We're center writers.
All right, cool. Center right.
Fact.
I don't want
to
out
of the closet at this
label
point,
anyone unnecessarily, but I appreciate it. And so I'm hoping you can speak to why you think that there are red states like Montana and Utah that restore voting rights sooner than Washington, and why we've seen so much bipartisan support for this issue in other parts of the country recently.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a son of Washington, and anybody who lives there knows that Washington is slightly schizophrenic as it relates to being a red state or a blue state. I mean, if you drive out to Spokane, that big meaty area where they grow a lot of stuff is very red in many ways. So I think, it isn't as clear cut in Washington as a lot of people think it is, especially for us over here on the other side. I grew up in Seattle, go Hawks, and it's in my blood. But I also understand it's a little complicated. I think that the answer for this is this is going to sound, a little cheeky, but I think it's the truth, is that if you really are a conservative, if you really are a center-righter, then your bedrock has to be the idea that the government has to be limited. A limited government has to be at our core, or if it isn't, then I'm sorry, brother or sister, you're not a center-righter. You're just not. You cannot be conservative and believe in a government that's allowed to act arbitrarily and capricious against its own people. It just does not align up. I know a lot of people right now are thinking, what are you talking about? That's all we've seen over the last several years. And yeah, you're right. I think there are some states that are trying to get back to that core. We can't, I think that, Terry talked about this a lot. You cannot disinherit a generation of Americans from the American dream and then act surprised that they don't want to participate anymore. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about the American dream. And I know people didn't come here for an altar call, but I think it's important for anybody who identifies on the center right. And it's definitely important when you're doing policy work and you're trying to enforce and inform the center right that this really doesn't align with our values. We want people to come back to the fold. And I think about, John 8:7, which was, the story of the parable of, cast the first stone. And people always hear that and they think, well, that's talking about hypocrisy. And they're right, that is talking about hypocrisy, but that's not the moral of the story. The moral of the story was people have to come back, because if you look at the law was that woman should be stoned to death. And Jesus didn't say, well, cast first, smaller stones or cast mud. He said, don't cast, let her come back. And that is really what I think that has to be the center of who we are on the center right. We have to believe that people can come back and be full-fledged citizens and not quasi-citizens or in this in-between stage. When you're done and you paid the price, and we can get in debate whether the pound of flesh that we enact is too much. I think it is. But when that flesh has been paid, you're a citizen again. And I think if you also, the thing that really resonates with me, if you look at most of the legislative history associated to voting disenfranchisement, it is directly rooted in racism. If you look at the act that did this in New York, for instance, you can actually go look on the floor. They were saying, we do not want Black people to vote. This is a way that we can prevent Black people from voting. So it wasn't even subtle. This is exactly the motivation of it all. And I think that you cannot divorce history from these lines. And someone who believes in center-right ideology, I am desperate to rebuild our relationship, to build our relationship with communities of color. And I think this is a way that we can do it. So for political reality, it's something that I see as a way for us to build our reputation again. I think we desperately need to build our reputation again on the right. I mean, yeah, you're right. R Street has a big, gigantic red R in our emblem, so it's not too hard to figure out where we're coming from. But I think that ideology has to align with our principles, and this is an easy principle for us to get behind. And I think that many states have seen that. And I think the two states you mentioned, Montana and Utah, they're very libertarian kind of focused states. But you saw this in Utah. Utah has a very red streak, and because the legislator wasn't moving, the governor just came in and did things. So I think that there is a lot to be said with those people. I know Arizona right now, I've been talking to the governor's office there, and this is something they're really interested in because they believe it aligns with their core principles.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, we also saw the governor of Iowa making progress on this. And when we've seen this issue go to the voters, I think often we've seen voters supporting rights restoration in a bipartisan way. I think we are starting to see that more and more people are not thinking about this as a partisan issue, which I think is helpful so we can have a productive policy conversation, because so often these things turn into partisan debates on so many issues, not just this one. Tarra, one of the questions we often get when we talk about this policy is whether it is respectful to crime survivors to restore voting rights upon release from prison. We've talked a lot about who it benefits and how it benefits our communities, but some people are concerned about the impact that it might have on those who have been the victims of crime themselves. And so I'm hoping you can respond to that notion.
Yes, thank you so much, Sean. You know, this really fits into something that's very personal and difficult as we have these conversations about who is a survivor and who is a defendant, because it puts people like me into binary identities. Long before I was ever a criminal defendant, I was a survivor of horrific crime throughout my childhood, from personal and sexual violence to structural violence as a mixed race young girl with a father who was a person of color. For generations, my family grew up in poverty and was exposed to violence and lived in public housing on food stamps. Those conditions lead to violence. And that is the story of every single woman I ever met in prison, is that they were survivors. And so the notion that this is somehow disrespectful to survivors is really hard to take, because our criminal justice system puts people into binary identities altogether. I will say that as I am now a representative and I have been talking with groups who do more closely identify with the survivor category, they feel like that argument is politicizing them and their experiences as well. And so I was really happy yesterday having a conversation with the King County Sexual Assault Center that they actually put this on their priority agenda for this year because of that rhetoric that was used in a partisan debate last year. And they do not want to be politicized and say that they are not for this. At the end of the day, survivors need healing. They're not going to get that by, seeing the person that caused them harm not be able to vote, right? They need an investment in their own healing journeys. And that's what we should be really looking at, and not playing into these kind of debates and pitting communities against each other who are often overlapping people.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point. Sometimes when in the name of respecting survivors, we're actually silencing survivors, because they are so often there is this overlap. So often the people who are being disenfranchised are themselves survivors, and it's more complicated than people want to make it. But I also really do appreciate the point about politicizing or attempting to speak on behalf of survivors rather than letting them speak for themselves. And so justifying a policy that can so often silence voices by speaking on their behalf is ironic, I suppose is maybe not a powerful enough word, but thank you for that. I want to go back to chat about another question we get a lot, and I think I saw some reference to this in the chat, and I do want to say, to the extent we don't address questions, I will try to make sure we get to them at the end, but I think some of them are going to get addressed along the way. So rather than breaking up the flow here, I'm going to go about it this way. But Chad, sometimes we hear proposals for carve-outs, that is to restore rights to everyone except for those convicted of certain offenses. Given the way the criminal justice system works, does that approach make sense to you? That is to say, these folks get their rights restored upon release from prison. These folks don't get their rights restored until after they've completed community supervision or some other rule. Yeah,
I guess the most common carve out that we'll hear is, we'll restore your rights unless we're convicted of a sex offense or a serious violent offense. I think there are some, practical considerations and maybe just more theoretical issues. In terms of the practice, that's putting, I think, a bit of a burden on auditors or the Secretary of State's office to be able to go through all of this conviction data and correctly identify what is a sex offense, what was a violent offense, what was a serious violent offense, which is not always an easy answer. Frankly, if you ask me right now, is indecent liberties a sex offense? I need to look it up. I don't remember. Is assault in the third degree a violent offense? I don't think it is, but I would need to look that up. And so essentially what we're doing is we're saying, auditor, Secretary of State, now we're going to need you to do this. Can that be done? Sure, you can put in a system to do that. But why? And I think that's what I come back to, is why. And maybe that takes us back to, at its very core, why do we not let people who have been convicted of crimes vote? As I said before, I don't think it's a punishment. I don't think in practicality that it is really an issue of punishment. I don't think that it's a deterrent. The other argument would be that we think that because you've been convicted of certain crimes that you lack the responsibility or lack the character to be somebody that we want voting. And I don't buy that. Regardless of what you have been convicted of, we still let you raise children. We still let you own property. We still let you do really important things in the community. And voting is just another one of those important things. So I'm not sure the cost of creating a carve-out, creating a system to do the carve-out, regularly updating that, because as statutes change, we're going to need to continually make sure that the auditors or the Secretary of State understands that this was considered a sex offense, now it's not, this wasn't, now it is, and going through that regular updating. I'm not sure that there's a real benefit at the end of the day to be doing that. I'm not sure that there's a benefit to making things more complicated, because I don't think we're getting, as a community, I don't think we get much out of it, frankly. And in particular, I know sex offenses can be a tricky one. We do put conditions on people who have been convicted of sex offenses that sometimes go long past their service in the prison. The most obvious one being that they have to register. There's a rational reason that you can connect the crime to that condition. There is a rational reason why we're saying you've been convicted of a sex offense. We need to notify the community that you're going to live in. I don't think I cannot form a rational reason between you've committed this sex offense and you shouldn't vote. That's just not a connection that I can draw. And so because of that, I don't think there is a benefit to the cost of putting together a system that carves out different crimes or specific crimes that we would say your right to vote remains taken away from you.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it, that there's the practical burden of one of these carve-outs, and then what are we using to justify placing that practical burden? And I guess another way I think about it, I'm curious your thoughts on this, is the criminal justice system, you know better than anybody, a lot of thought goes into and a lot of time goes into the sentence that someone is given in the system. And it's a sentence that's, given with attention to the detailed facts of that individual person's case. And we could probably have a lot of arguments, Arthur alluded to this already, about whether or not our criminal justice system is always making the right call on the length of the sentence and everything else. But the fact is that the severity of the offense, the type of offense, is already taken into account in that process. And so I guess, is it the case that no matter what offense you're convicted of, the moment when you are let out of prison and returned to community and then asked to reintegrate yourself into the community is something that is already taken into account the level of offense that you were convicted of?
Right. So in the state of Washington, under the Sentencing Reform Act, every felony offense, you have a seriousness level. And we look at the seriousness level of the crime, and we look at your criminal history. And based upon those two things, your sentence is going to be higher or lower. So those people who have been convicted of sex offenses, those people who have been convicted of violent offenses, they are going to get longer sentences than somebody who is, convicted of a nonviolent offense. So that punishment aspect of it is already, that increased punishment is already part of the sentencing scheme. That's already part of the system. And so it's been accounted for. The other thing, and just in terms of the way the criminal justice system works and the practicalities of it, the crime that you've been convicted of may not necessarily reflect what actually happened. And that's just the reality. Sometimes we don't have the evidence to convict somebody of a higher offense that we think they committed. Sometimes we will negotiate based upon, not necessarily what the crime is, but what we think the appropriate punishment should be. There are people who will technically commit a crime that has a very high sentencing range, but the prosecutor who looks at the facts of the case and knows the facts of the case and speaks with the victim of the case, we may go with a lesser charge. And one of the things that concerns me is making sure that everybody across the state is treated similarly. And so, for example, here in Kitsap County, we've got a lot of different programs that we can put people in so that they don't get that criminal offense or that felony offense. We've got drug courts, we've got behavioral health courts, we've got veterans court, we've got all of these diversion programs. You go out to some of the smaller counties, they don't have the resources for those programs. So somebody can commit a crime here in Kitsap County, we can put them into a program, we can get them treatment, we can get them counseling, we can get them job training, and they can avoid that conviction, and their right to vote is never impacted. You could commit that same exact offense somewhere else in the state of Washington that maybe doesn't have the resources for those programs, and you will lose that right to vote. And so I think there's a fairness issue there that concerns me. Through no fault of the offender, they have lost a very important right.
And I take it your point is that the carve-outs only exacerbate that problem, that adding more variables to this instead of these bright lines of when you're in the community, you can vote. And I should say, we've been talking a lot about community supervision as a reentry, sort of from the reentry perspective. But there are, of course, many people on community supervision that were never incarcerated, never went to prison. And so I want to make that note here. Having a bright line where everyone living in the community can vote avoids some of those messy issues that you're talking about, where once we start putting carve-outs into effect. And really, I think, and you could think of it as sort of deferring to the criminal justice system to handle those messy details, and not make that part of our electoral system. Instead, say that in our elections, we think that if you're living in the community, paying taxes, raising a family, sending your kids to school, doing all the things that community members do, that we think that you should have a say in the way that your community functions, and that we want you, in fact, we want to encourage you to see yourself as part of that larger community and encourage you to exercise your voice and take hold of that stake that you have in your community. And that I think that's better for all of us. I do want to touch on something that Arthur got to earlier. Arthur, feel free to chime in here, but really this is a question for everyone, whoever would like to pick up on it, which is, Arthur talked about the history of felony disenfranchisement really across the country. The United States has a fairly unique system in the way that it disenfranchises people with convictions. It's not the way most of our sort of peer democracies handle this. And that comes out of a very particular history. In many states, these were laws that were passed immediately after, or at least changed immediately after the Civil War, as pretty explicit attempts to disenfranchise Black men and evade the mandate of the 15th Amendment. That's a really important history that I appreciate Arthur bringing up. There's also the reality of how these policies function in 2020 in our communities. And I think we've all seen this year around the country, including in Washington, the nation really start to grapple more honestly with racial injustice and racial justice. And with the built-in structural inequality in our criminal justice system. And so I'm hoping one or more of you can speak to not just the historical reality, but the present reality of the way that this policy of disenfranchisement has a sort of exacerbates or highlights or intensifies the racial injustice that we already have in so many other aspects of our society.
I'll start real briefly. For me, and you're exactly right. I did a prison tour in Germany, and we were talking about this, and the people were baffled because, for them, being incarcerated is enough. They vote while they're incarcerated because that is just the way they see things. So for me, this is not a left or right issue. I know that I'm usually the token conservative, but it's really a right or wrong issue. And the dirty secret about mass incarceration, and which leads to mass disenfranchisement, is that for 40 plus years, the left and right kind of ganged up on this idea of tough on crime, used it as a political punchline, and then use fear mongering based on racial undertones to basically sit on the back of those with the smallest voice. And the history of the United States, you cannot point to one policy that has been brought forth because of fear and look at it as being a good thing. That is why every single law named after a person sucks. You cannot point to one that's a good law. Not one. There's not one out there. I think there's one back like the Mann Act. You have to go back to the turn of the century kind of stuff. So, we keep hearing these kind of punchlines, and it still happens today. And I'm embarrassed that it mostly comes from us on the right. But, the fact is that we don't actually know, how people are going to vote. And so we shouldn't be suspecting or predicting how this is going to play out. And I think that a lot of that has racial undertones that you were kind of, alluding to. And again, I think it's something that we have to look in the face and we have to say this is wrong and we're going to do something about it.
Thanks. Anyone else want to chime in on that? I think there's probably a lot of different ways we can.
The other thing that I would add is, when you say this is about being tough on crime, and I think that's true. That's been the message for a long time as justification for this. It's just not. This just does not impact the work that I do as a prosecutor. It really doesn't. Like I said, I have sat with hundreds, if not thousands, of defendants when I was their attorney. And you go over their rights, and you go over the rights that they will lose if they get convicted. Only one person ever raised an issue with this. You hear it watching people get convicted in court or plead guilty in court. The judge always goes over this with them. And nobody has said anything about it, which makes me conclude this isn't a deterrent. This isn't a punishment that is impactful. It is a punishment. That's probably the correct thing to say, is that it's a punishment. Is it a punishment that's impactful? Is it a punishment that is making our community safer? It's not. My experience is it's not. It is like I said, it is a deterrent to bringing people back into the community.
Thank you. I don't want to cut off anyone else that wanted to chime in on this.
Can I just respond really quick to what Chad said?
Sure.
I think he hit something that rang around in my brain. It is a punishment, but if it doesn't have any attachment to public safety, then it fails the test of parsimony. And that is really what our goal is supposed to be. This idea that punishment shouldn't be part of the criminal justice system, I think is naive. I think it should be a part of the criminal justice system, But when you pass the line of getting the results that you want, then you have passed the line of parsimony, and then you're in vengeance. And vengeance is for the Lord. And I really believe that if people just thought about that, if you do not know what the word parsimony means, look it up, read it, and then tattoo it to your arm, because every single person who's a policymaker, it should be your motto. And if you do not have this as your motto, I'm sorry, you're kind of failing us, because it is really what the criminal justice is supposed to be. Every prosecutor should have that tattooed on their arm. Everybody who works in this space should have that tattooed on their arm. It is what we're supposed to be doing. And I think that was a really astute observation by Chad, because I really think it really resonates why this is such a dumb way of doing business. It doesn't make us safer. It doesn't make us more free. It doesn't make us feel more like we're part of the community. It does everything to divide us, separate us. And then again, we like, I just don't understand why these people won't, come back. Well, because you have thrown them in a dumpster for the rest of their lives. Why would they want to come back? And that was my preacher side of myself. But I really think that was a great point that Chad made.
That's okay. We're okay with preacher Arthur. Again, if Terry or Tara wants to chime in, I don't mean to stop you, so feel free to talk right over me. But
yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Terry.
Oh, thank you, Terry. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, somebody who's like in all kinds of policy task force meetings around the criminal legal system and the goals of it. And there is absolutely a part of it, which is punishment. But in our current system, it is too much on the punishment that we actually overpunish, which doesn't give people any pathways and hope to, re-enter and seek rehabilitation. And for this issue in particular, people are not saying, oh, I'm not going to rob that bank today because I might lose my voting right. Not right. It is, things that make people pause is maybe the length of sentence, the time away from home, maybe losing their job, being away from their families. It's not their voting right. That's not the reason they stop and pause and think about not committing a crime.
Yeah. I just want to raise one point, and that's this, is that when a person is released from prison or jail, they have to follow the laws. They have to pay the taxes that people have voted on. So why shouldn't they have a right to be able to be a part of that?
It's a great way to put it and think about it, I think. I did want to briefly touch on it. I think the goal here was to have about an hour with us all talking at one another and then maybe move on to some questions. So I want to respect that. But I think one thing I wanted to touch on, and if anyone wants to sum us up with something on this, I'd welcome it. But, we talked for a second there about the racial realities and the racial injustice in this policy. I think one way that we at the Brennan Center have thought about this, and some others have done some good work on this, is that disenfranchisement does not just impact the people who themselves lose their right to vote. There are a variety of ways that it goes beyond that. There's some research that demonstrates that communities that are hit especially hard by disenfranchisement see decreases, controlling for all other factors, see decreases in turnout even among those who are eligible to vote. Because I do think it sends a message to an entire community when huge swaths of that community are locked out of democracy as to whether or not that community's voice matters, it alienates folks. It is also true that there is, that people learn civic engagement and voting and those habits from watching their elders and from watching their parents. And so there's also, research that demonstrates that this has, ripple effects beyond the people who are directly impacted that way. And then there's other ways we can think about both the way that these impacts are concentrated on certain communities of color, communities stricken by poverty, but also ways that we can think about how this policy impacts all of us and impacts more of us than just the people who have lost their right to vote. And so if any of you have any closing thoughts before we turn to questions about the way that this is an issue for the entire community, for the entire state of Washington, and not just for the people who themselves are disenfranchised. And I want to ask that question while acknowledging how grateful I am, and I think all of us are, for hearing the personal stories and perspectives of Terry and Tarra. I know it's not easy to share those. And I do think it's very helpful for us to all hear what this means to the people who are directly impacted. But I do also want to talk for a second about how this is an issue that impacts everyone across the board.
Yeah, I think that, when I think about our community and people that are not directly impacted, we want to build safe communities. And part of that is helping people engage in pro-social behaviors. If they're engaging in pro-social behaviors, then they are least likely to be committing crime as well. And voting is, when you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it is a higher up there, right? It's not just going and getting a job. It is taking proactive steps to register, to educate yourself, maybe to become involved civically and go to your city councils and get to know your elected officials and building relationships with other people who are participating in something higher. And so we want to encourage those behaviors and welcome people home and set them up for success so they're not recommitting crimes, which then saves us all money, as taxpayers. So I think everybody in our community has a vested interest in seeing people succeed. And this is a way we can help people become active in their communities and succeed.
Excuse me, and Tarra actually just almost exactly said what I was about to say. When somebody comes and commits a crime and is convicted of a crime, my goal at that point is to make sure that they don't commit another one. And the way you do that is you impose punishment for the one that you've done, and you impose supervision. Well, does this help? Does not being able to vote discourage people from committing crimes? I understand the theory, and I understand that you may think it does, but I'm telling you, it doesn't. It is not something that people think about. I think, like it was said earlier, is that crossing your mind before you rob the bank? No, you're thinking about, I don't want to do 2 years in prison. I don't want to be away from my family for 2 years. I don't want to go to the county jail. I don't want to go to prison. Those are the things that you're thinking about. Those are things that people are actually thinking about. They're not thinking, gosh, there's a special election coming up and I'm going to miss. That's not crossing their mind. So does it discourage future crime? I really, practically speaking, I don't think so. Does it help encourage community involvement? I think it does. And that prevents crime. Community involvement, I think, prevents committing that future crime. And so that is where I think there's a community benefit.
Just if I could just chime in for 1 second. Chad, you're absolutely right. From past experience, when you're getting ready to commit a crime or thoughts of doing something illegal, the last thing you're thinking about is voting. So I do agree with you on that.
Right. Well, I do want to make sure that we have time for questions here. And I think there were one or two in the chat so far that I can turn to, but if people have questions that I haven't raised them, happy to address those as well. And I will just say, I'm seeing some comments about the importance of considering the perspective of crime victims. And I hope that everyone was able to hear. We did talk about that early on in the conversation. And so, but if that's an issue people feel have particular questions about, I think we can certainly talk about that issue among others. But and we are also recording. So to the extent folks missed that earlier conversation, I want to note that there was a question earlier on about whether or not there are any exemptions regarding restoring the right to vote. Are all convicted persons able to restore their right to vote after they've served their time, regardless of whether they're convicted of it? We did talk, we addressed that a little bit in the conversation about whether or not it makes sense to have carve-outs. But in case it wasn't clear from that discussion, I would just say there are currently not carve-outs. So right now, the rule in Washington is that you have your right restored to you, regardless of the nature of the offense of what the conviction was for, upon completion of community supervision, with that sort of weird caveat that there's in theory an idea that paying legal financial obligations could matter, but it's not actually the way that it practically plays out. And so when we're having this conversation about carve-outs, it's in the context of, you know, if the proposed legislation were to change that moment of restoration, or change the rule to, if you are living in the community, then you have the right to vote, would it make sense to build carve-outs in where there haven't been carve-outs before? And I think we talked about that a little bit and heard a number of perspectives as to why that isn't a good idea. But there was also a question I want to go back to here. Oh, there was a question directly for Representative-elect Simmons as to whether or not the bill has been assigned a number for the upcoming session. So I'll leave that to you.
Yes, no, it has not yet, but it will be very shortly in the next week or two. And I did see that somebody had asked if I can pre-file the bill, and yes, I can, and plan to do that definitely before session starts.
I don't see a lot of other questions in the chat, but I do want to make sure that people, I don't want to just start talking if people have things to raise. I want to do that. I do like to talk. But if anyone has other questions they'd like us to address, then we're happy to. If not, I'm sure I can keep asking questions of our panelists and keep us going, but just want to give a moment for that so that if people do have things they want to.
I'm sorry, I don't know if my question was addressed. I know you just kind of repeated it. My name is Michelle Hansman. I'm Representative Amy Wallen's legislative assistant. And so I was just curious where the current law lies with voting rights restoration. Is everyone eligible? And this bill is just seeking to address the legal and financial obligations that are currently in the way, or are some people currently ineligible to have their voting rights restored?
Thank you. Sorry if I didn't give a clear response. I'm happy to take that one myself, unless if I fail to give a clear response again, someone else should tell me. The current state of the law in Washington is that anyone convicted of a felony loses their right to vote for any period of incarceration or community supervision. And they get their right to vote back when they've completed any term of incarceration or supervision automatically. However, the law does say that restoration is provisional if you still owe legal financial obligations, and that it can therefore be revoked for failure to timely make payment on legal financial obligations. It used to be the case that there was a requirement that you pay off all your legal financial obligations before voting. That was removed, I believe, 11 years ago. The reality is that actually no one is required to pay legal financial obligations in Washington in order to have their right restored today, because no one is ever revoking. And as far as I'm aware, and anyone I've talked to is aware, no one has ever had their right revoked for failure to pay legal financial obligations. I think there are some real federal constitutional questions that come up when the right to vote is contingent on paying legal financial obligations that I don't think we need to get into here, because it isn't actually the way things function in Washington as a practical matter. So the goal of the legislation that's been introduced the last couple of sessions and that we expect to see in the coming session would be to change the moment of automatic restoration. So it would still be the case that financial obligations are not on the table, but that would actually just be stricken from the law entirely. So we don't have this sort of confusing non-functional law that's on the books. It would still be the case that the exact offense you committed wouldn't be relevant to the question. It would just change the idea that you have to complete both incarceration and community supervision before having your rights restored, and instead would say, if you're incarcerated, you're ineligible to vote. If you're living in the community, you're eligible. I hope that was a clearer answer.
Sean, I don't know if, I guess I have a question, which is unusual for a panelist. I don't know if you or Arthur might know the answer to this. As the law has periodically changed in the state of Washington, I can't recall, at least in my experience, seeing big changes or changes at all in terms of crime rates. If we look at other states, do you know if there has been research into whether crime has increased when the law has been changed in this way? Just my own personal experiences, I haven't seen it, but I don't know if there's data or statistics from other states on that.
There's zero out there to indicate anyway. There's no data out there to indicate even how people are going to vote, let alone are they going to commit crimes. I mean, actually, sadly, the only piece of data we do know is that people with past criminal history records have a very low voting rate, period. But who they vote for, not tracked, no data to support that. And does it lead to more or less crime? No data. I will say there is literature that supports the idea that the closer that you're tied into your community, the closer that you're tied into family, employment, has a enormous effect on. I hate using the word recidivism because it's one of those words that mean nothing because nobody can define what recidivism actually means. But it's one of those things that there's nothing that suggests that it actually has any effect on it. And I see some of the chat going on from people that seem pretty pissed of some of the things that we're talking about right now. And I would ask this person, Jenny, do you want your community to be safer? And there is zero data to support that anything that we've talked about today would actually make us less safe. In fact, it's the contrary. The more that we can bring people back to the fold, the more likely they are to commit less crime in the future. So, I mean, these are the facts. I mean, we can argue with facts if we want. I'll do that offline with you, but that is the data we have today.
Yeah, no, I agree with Arthur. I am aware of absolutely zero research that has ever suggested that restoring voting rights leads to an increase in crime. There is research that says that encouraging people to engage in productive ways in their community makes them less likely to offend. There is some research, though. There's a study out of Florida that showed that people who had their rights restored were less likely recidivate. It's sort of hard to replicate, and so I don't want to make some sort of conclusive scientific statement that restoring voting rights will lead to a decrease in crime. I don't think that that's a fair assessment of the empirical data, because it's actually like a really hard thing to measure and to study. But I do think there's plenty of research, as Arthur alluded to, about the impact that that really we are. If our goal is safety, our goal is reintegration, our goal is healthy communities, that we send people exactly the wrong message when we tell them they don't have a stake in their community and that that their voice does not matter. And we send them the right message for those goals if we encourage them to think of themselves as part of a larger community, as part of the whole. And we encourage the pro-social behavior. Really, you know, there are a few things that are more sort of high-level pro-social behavior, thinking about the way that you fit into your community at large, unselfish behaviors, like voting. It is really one of those times when we exercise our responsibility to participate in our community in a very abstract and pro-social way. So I think it is sending people the right message to encourage them to do that, and it's sending the people the right message that they have a stake in their community. And so all research that has touched on this, I think, suggests the opposite, that it would have a good impact on public safety and not a bad one. And I will just say, states are all over the map on this, literally and figuratively. There are states over on one end of the spectrum in Washington and Vermont, and now Maine, Vermont, and now Washington, D.C., where you never lose your right to vote even while you're in prison. And there are states, thankfully, no longer any states in the country as of this year that permanently disenfranchise everyone convicted of a felony for the rest of their life, but there are still states that can disenfranchise some people permanently. And then there are states everywhere in between, including where Washington is, including many states. I believe it is now 18 states that restore voting rights automatically upon release from prison. And we certainly don't see some relationship or correlation among those states. The places with high crimes are the places, high crime rates are the places that let people vote, and the places that don't let anyone vote aren't seeing any crime. I don't think anyone would argue that Florida, who's perhaps been the stingiest with voting rights for decades, has figured out the solution to preventing crime. So no, I just don't think that if our goal here is to disenfranchise in order to pursue public safety, that there's any factual data or any even anecdotal support for the idea that we're accomplishing that when we deny people the right to vote. I did want to, unless people have other things they wanted to raise or questions they wanted to bring up, I did want to turn to something you just mentioned, Arthur, which is that we talked a little bit about the partisan nature of this debate sometimes before, and how people think about this as a Republican versus Democrat issue, but really it hasn't been in many ways across the country, and as you put it, shouldn't be. Another way, unfortunately, that I think we often hear this issue discussed is people prognosticating about the impact it's going to have on elections, whether it's going to swing an election one way or another, how people are going to vote, whether or not they're more likely to vote with one party than another, and sort of with the suggestion being that we should be making our decision about this policy based on assumptions about how that's going to go. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
I mean, as I mentioned, there's first of all, there is zero data to actually indicate any way, shape, or form how people are going to vote. But I think the fact that that's such a concern, especially from my side, is a little embarrassing because it pulls back the curtain on why people actually care about this. And if we are in the business to create policy that is for the good of the people, then this shouldn't be something we're even really. I'm glad we are discussing it because I think it's important. But it really does show of why this has become more of a gotcha politic issue. I mean, everything that I've actually heard here today suggests that this is going to have almost no impact on what actually even happens, because it doesn't sound like there's prosecutors out there, hunting for people who haven't paid back a fine or a fee. So it doesn't even really have an impact, period. It's just an issue about righteousness. And I mean, and if that's really what it is, then I'm baffled by why there's opposition to this idea that when people are done with their sentence, that they should be able to come out and be full-fledged members of our society. And while they're paying their other debts they have, which, by the way, we know through literature related to fines and fees that very often it's a life sentence. If I get a $500 speeding ticket, my wife's going to be so pissed at me, but it's not going to make me make a decision whether or not I'm going to be if I'm going to be able to, vote or not. I mean, that's an insane position to put people in. And also, I mean, data has to mean something. I mean, even the conversation we were having about whether it should apply to these people or that people, it's not based in data at all. I mean, one of the lowest recidivism rates is actually murder. Why? Because most murder is done by spouses, and my wife can only murder me once. She's I always say that if you're married, you have at least thought about murder once in your life. I mean, I think that's a fact. It just baffles me why this isn't something that is at the tip of our spear. It doesn't actually affect that much, except for the person that it impacts, and it makes them feel whole again. And I think that is something that we should, I mean, nobody here on the call is saying that people shouldn't go to prison when they commit certain crimes. That's not a part of this conversation. What we're saying is, can you come back to the fold? Can you come back and be a part of society? Can you come back and be a member of our churches and our communities and our families again, full-fledged? And if we say yes to that, I'm a little confused about why we're talking about this as if it's a debate. It should be. I mean, listen, clean slate. I can understand some of the Tara and I worked on that. I can understand some of the opposition there. If this isn't in the same lane, this is something that is just really is something that just makes sense, and it makes everybody feel like they're part of the community again. So I don't know if that answered your question, Sean, but
it does. Thank you. I think, yeah, the data, I think we saw comment on the sidebar there too. The few attempts at trying to study impact on how people vote have been inconclusive at best. But I agree with you, and I think it's a really important point to make that shouldn't be how we decide who gets to vote and who doesn't. We shouldn't be doing that based on whether we think they'll be on our side or not. But I do think the few chances that there have been to study this, I think people might, I think they undermine a lot of people's assumptions about. The fact is that, I guess another way I should say this is, the fact is anybody who's opining about the impact it's going to have elections is doing so based entirely on assumptions, because there isn't anything to back it up besides those kinds of assumptions. So I think we're getting close to the end of the hour and a half here, and we went through most of the things we were hoping to talk about today. I don't want to cut conversation short if folks have additional questions or additional things that they want to raise up, but I also don't want to drag this on needlessly if people feel like their questions have been answered. So anyone want to make any final statements before we all sign off, or does anyone have any final questions? If no one else has any sign-off statements, I will say thank you so much for having me here virtually from snowy Brooklyn, New York, where we actually had a snow day today. My daughter is home. We had a nor'easter blizzard, so it's been nice to virtually be in Washington for the afternoon. But I really thought this was a great conversation. I really so much appreciate all of the panelists for joining and taking time out to talk about this issue that I care so much about, and giving us so many different perspectives and sharing some personal stories. And I hope that we've answered questions that people have. I'm really excited for the possibility for this bill in the upcoming session. I think it's something that's been on the table for a while now in Washington. It's a state that has really led so much in the realm of democracy, and has, I think, been a leader in the country in terms of showing us how democracies can function and how they can work. And this is one issue where Washington's behind a big chunk of the country, red and blue. And so I think it is, it's great to see that there's a chance for this to be moving in the next few months. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining and listening in, and to all the panelists for participating. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you all.